The problem really that we encounter when we read through the book of Galatians, when we study it through the lens of the hypothesis that I'm postulating tonight about covenant membership being driven by ethnicity and things like that, is that in order for the Gentiles to join Israel through this method, they have to go through this man-made conversion policy. But the problem is that for Sha'ul, no such man-made conversion policy existed in Scripture. See the point? That can't be the solution to the problem in Paul's eyes because it's not scriptural. In order for the solution to be a valid solution to the problem in the first century of how does one become a covenant member, how does one become righteous, how does one become saved, in order for it to be a valid solution, Paul has to be able to locate the solution from within the existing scriptures that were given to Israel. See my point? And so Paul is going to go back through his own Bible to find the solution to the problem that the first century Jews were faced with, that the first century Gentiles were faced with. And so in Paul's eyes, conversion was not part of the solution because it was not part of Scripture. And that's what made it a big problem. What is the solution? Let's keep reading. By contrast, Sha'ul taught most assuredly that Gentiles were grafted into the remnant of Israel the same way that Avraham was counted as righteous by God in Bereshit, which is Genesis chapter 15. And what do we read there? Speaking of Abraham, he believed in the Lord and it was counted to him as righteousness. So therefore, from Paul's perspective, the solution to the problem was faith in the promised word of the Lord, viz., faith in Yeshua, who is the word of the Lord, the word made flesh that we read about in John chapter 1. Thus, the original Greek phrase that we encounter for works of the law, ergo namu, it actually has a Hebrew counterpart, which is ma'aseh haTorah. Now, what meaneth ma'aseh haTorah? Well, this phrase, ma'aseh haTorah in Hebrew, is actually found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, the DSS. It uses this phrase as well. I have a footnote in my commentary number 61 that shows that I lifted that from the Dead Sea Scrolls 4Q MMT section C 25 through 32, if you want to go back and read that on your own in English. This particular phrase from the Dead Sea Scrolls, particularly those manuscripts that we've now come to refer to as this phrase, works of law, actually refers to, quote, some of the precepts of the Torah. In other words, it's not the whole Torah, it's just parts of the Torah. And it's those parts that were adjudicated by each sectarian halakha, each sectarian group policy. And these particular group policies were implemented by whichever various community wielded the most influence over any particular group. So that's one of the ways that works of the law shows up historically in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And that kind of helps us to form our opinion of this term, since it's otherwise noticeably absent anywhere else in the Torah. In other words, works of the law almost seems as if Paul just plucked it out of thin air. Ergo namu. What does that mean? Ergo namu. You know, it's almost like he made it up. So until we discovered this terminology in the works in the Dead Sea Scrolls back in the 50s, many Bible commentators were basically scratching their heads. They didn't know what works of the law meant, and that's why we assumed as Christians that it must have meant obedience to the law. Works of the law actually sounds like works done in obedience to the law. In other words, it sounds like merit theology. So let's keep reading. To be sure, the common social perspective of first century religious Israel taught that Gentile inclusion into covenant Israel only by way of conversion, read here most often as circumcision, viz. Jewish identity in Galatians 5:2. This conversion was naturally at odds with the true gospel of Gentile inclusion into the community of Israel by faith in Yeshua plus nothing. Right? If we understand that quite likely Sha'ul's socio-religious use of the term circumcision in Galatians 5:2 is actually shorthand for, quote, the man-made ritual that sought to turn Gentiles into Jews before they could be counted as covenant members, end quote, then, in my opinion, the letter begins to make more sense Hebraically, and contextually. And that, by the way, is why we focused on circumcision last week. So go back and pick up last week's podcast. Go head on out to iTunes and Google search my name, HaNaviy, my last name, HANAVIY in iTunes, and you should be able to pull up my Galatians commentaries and listen to last week's, and you'll get a snapshot of circumcision to that light.